Tomatoes. There is nothing better than homegrown tomatoes. The stuff you buy in the shops is just not even close. And I should point out, it's April. These are from the shops. So given that it's that time then, everybody's thinking about and talking about tomatoes, today we're going to do a quick dash through tomatoes from seed to harvest. Here we go. Now, there are lots of different types of tomatoes. I mean, I held up just a few here, so these would all pretty much be called cherry tomatoes because they're the really small little size ones. You can also get big beefsteak tomatoes, which are the really, really big ones, and I grow those. I grow Marmande beefsteak tomatoes. You get plum tomatoes, which are little elongated tomatoes. Salad tomatoes, there's all sorts. Basically, it's all about the shape and size. But if you're growing tomato plants, it's more the type of plant you're growing than the variety of the finished fruit that you want to think about. And here's why. There are essentially two types of tomato plant. There is what's called an indeterminate plant and a determinate plant. And it's this simple. If I say cordon or vine tomatoes, we kind of know what that means. That's the big tall ones that grow on one big stem. Those are indeterminate tomatoes, meaning there is no determined size that they grow to. They just keep growing until pretty much you stop them by nipping out the tips. And in my greenhouse here, I can have tomatoes that are easily 7 foot tall. The other version, which gets called a bush tomato, is a determinate tomato. It grows to a determined size, usually around the 4 foot in height mark. But just be aware, you also get dwarf or patio bush tomatoes, and that's what I'm growing here in the garden this year for the first time. And they're really, really, really tiny, but they're still a determinate tomato because they grow to a determinate size. Now, this is important when we get to pruning, so I'll talk about that later on. So if we start with the basics then, tomatoes need 4 things for you to get the absolute best out of them. Number 1, they need heat and sunlight. Now, they really need the heat. Tomatoes are what we call a hot crop or a warm crop, which means basically they come from a hot climate and they like to be in a hot environment when they grow. And when I say hot, you will hear an awful lot of gardeners online telling you the minimum, the absolute minimum your tomato plants need to survive is 10°C. And that is 10°C all of the time, including overnight, which is why we tend to not grow tomatoes until a bit later here in the UK. However, to get them to thrive and actually produce and be the best they can be, they need to be warmer than that. They need to be 15°C and above. So remember that one. If you're growing your tomatoes in your garden, make sure there's a nice, sunny, sheltered spot that can keep them nice and warm and safe. So tomato plants need a lot of water, and if they don't have regular watering, you can see 2 problems happening. Number 1 is that you can see the skins of the tomatoes will split, and this happens when you get irregular watering where there's not so much water and then an awful lot of water, and the fruits suddenly swell and hence the skin bursts. The second thing that happens is that irregular watering is actually the most common cause of blossom end drop. So again, if the tomato plant goes without water for too long, it actually stops it being able to take up the nutrients it needs in the soil, namely calcium, and that causes blossom end drop. So you need to make sure that you're watering your tomato plants regularly, but importantly, not regularly as in giving them a bit of water every day. You're much better to give them an absolute drenching. Properly water them deeply. If they're in a pot, making sure you're getting right down so it's wet at the bottom of the pot. If they're out in a bed, making sure that all of that soil around them is good and wet, so that they have the water they need over a period of days, rather than them relying on you coming in every single day. You'll get a much better harvest that way. And obviously, watering goes hand in hand with nutrition. So before you plant your tomato plants out into your bed in the soil, or potting them up into a pot, make sure that there is plenty of nutrition in that soil for them. If need be, you can amend your soil before you plant, adding compost or even you could add something like fish blood and bone if you wanted to. But as your plants grow and they start producing flowers, which will then become fruit, you want to make sure that you're feeding them weekly with a high potash tomato feed. That way you'll get the very best out of them. Like with many other seeds, sowing your tomato seeds aren't complicated at all. You can either sow them into little individual modules, or you can even sow them into a tray, like these ones, like I do. The trick is to make sure that your soil that you're sowing your seeds into is nice and moist. Those seeds want that moisture, but they also want it to be warm. Tomato seeds germinate best at around 20°C in a nice humid environment. So what you want to do is put your little module tray, pots, trays, whatever you've sown into, put them into a propagator if you can, making sure the vents are open. But if you don't have a propagator, you could just put a polythene bag over the tray or the pot and put an elastic band round it just to create a little seal. And that'll give it that nice humid atmosphere that it's after. And then put it somewhere warm, could be a sunny windowsill indoors, or if you've got a heated propagator or a heated greenhouse, something like that, somewhere where it's going to be about 20°C. Obviously, that's ideal. If you can't get it exactly 20°C, don't worry. It just means it might germinate a little bit slower if it's cooler. That's all. As soon as you see those little seedlings sprouting through the soil, take the lid off the propagator or the polythene bag off the pot, however you're doing it, to let some proper airflow get about, because no seedlings like it to be too damp and humid while they're little plants and they're growing. If you're growing your plants in the little tiny modules or in small seed trays, when they start to develop their true leaves, so that is their second set of leaves, you want to move them onto a larger space, because you want them to have space to grow, for those roots to grow, and also you want there to be a little bit more potting mix in there to give that little plant some nutrition. When you're transplanting those little seedlings out from one pot or tray to another, remember, hold them by the leaves, never the stem. The stem is really delicate and you don't want to damage it, so always use those leaves. If you're not sowing the seeds direct, meaning into the place that they're going to spend their entire life, you may need to pot on maybe 2 or even 3 times before it's time for that little plant to end up in its final place. And how do you know when it's time to do that? Quite simply, you'll see the roots start to come through the bottom of the pot when it's outgrown that pot, and that's time to move on to a bigger pot. One good thing to remember though, if you're growing your little seedlings indoors, even on a sunny windowsill, remember they will need extra light. They need light from all directions, above, the back, the front, not just in one, if you want them to stop getting leggy. When it's time to put them in their final place, which for me are these pots in my quad grow system in the greenhouse, they will need support. Whether they're outdoors or indoors, they will need some kind of support. For me, I use these canes. I find this to be the best way to support them. Some people like to use string, which they actually bury the string under the little baby plant so that it grows with the string there, and as it grows you can just wind the string around the plant. You can fix it to maybe a post in the greenhouse. I'm not a fan of that though. I've found, unfortunately, that when I've used the string method, the string can cut into the plant and cause damage, so I prefer to go with these canes. And I have this handy plant I've grown earlier so that I can show you something. So one of the other topics that people get really caught up on about with tomato plants is pruning. Okay, so I mentioned earlier that there are basically 2 types of tomatoes. There is the indeterminate, which is the big tall ones, or the determinate, which are the short bushes. The indeterminate is the ones that you need to really think about in terms of pruning, because they get something called suckers, and it is this. You have your main tomato stem, and then you have your leaves that come off the stem. But in the junction between the two, you get these little growths here called suckers. They'll actually grow to be a whole new stem, and they take all the energy away from the plant. So you want to just sit and pull them off, just with your finger and thumb, just tweak them off wherever you see them, so that you've got the one central stem growing. That's the best way to do it. If you don't notice them, they sometimes get quite big and quite thick. It's exactly the same though. Just press it over and it will snap, and you can pinch it off. Now, the other point you want to think about in pruning is much later on in your plant's life. And it's when you're coming to the end of the season and you want to get all those tomatoes to ripen. Those tomatoes need heat in order to ripen. So what we do towards the end of the season is we take away any excess leaves that aren't needed so that the sunlight and the air can get into the fruits to help that plant to ripen. Obviously though, remember, the plant will need leaves in order to photosynthesize, so don't go mad. Now, here's a top tip for you. When you're growing your plants, it is generally accepted that if you're growing them in the greenhouse, you want to take that top tip out of your indeterminates when you've got about 5 or 6 trusses of fruit on the plant. If you're growing them outdoors, you want to do that when there's about 4 or 5 trusses. The reason being, it may take a bit longer outdoors for things to ripen, and therefore if you nip the top off when it's only got the 4 or 5, you've got more chance of all those tomatoes ripening before it gets cooler towards the end of the season. Now, here's one of the things a lot of people don't realise: how tomatoes are pollinated. Tomato flowers have both the male and the female parts in them. The male part is above the female part, and vibration is what causes the male part to drop the pollen into the female part. So that would happen naturally with wind or with insects buzzing around them. If your tomato plants are in a greenhouse like mine, you may want to do a little bit of that buzzing around job to help the plants on, and it is this simple. All you need to do is just tap the flower on the plants. That's it, that's simple. So every time you're in your greenhouse, but doing your bits and bobs, just go around all your tomato plants and just tap on all the trusses, and that will help it to pollinate the flowers and you'll get a better harvest that way. So you have sown the seeds and germinated them. You've potted them on, they're in their final place, you've watered them, you've fed them, you've got heaps of fruit on that plant. The last thing to talk about then is ripening, and here it is. Those fruits need warmth in order to ripen. They need it to be nice and toasty. So if you're worried towards the end of the season and you're worried that you're not going to get everything ripe before the season's passed, you can go around the plant and you can pick off any flowers or very small fruits that you think they're not going to be full size and ripe before the end of the season, and that will help the plant to put all of its energy into those tomatoes that are already on the plant and starting to ripen. What you can also do, as I mentioned earlier, is take off some of the excess foliage, and that allows the sunlight, the heat, the air around the plant and helps to just get everything to ripen. So that's my whistle-stop tour of tomatoes from seed to harvest.